Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So here I have a axe. Let's not beat around the bush. It is an axe. It is an Indo-Persian. It would generally be described as antique Indo-Persian battle axe. It would probably be described in an auction catalogue. But it's Indian, almost certainly. Could be Persian, but probably Indian. There's a few interesting things to say about these. First of all, this is probably a fairly late example, probably you know, not the highest quality example, but nevertheless it is an interesting basic example. And why were they using battle axes still, or whatever you want to call this, at this period? Why were they using axes still in the 19th century? Well, the very simple fact is that a lot of people tend to think of 19th century warfare and they think about European warfare. So they think about the American Civil War or the Crimean War or the Franco-Prussian War, things like this. And you have to remember, of course, that a lot of the world wasn't at the same level of technology as Western European and, you know, American countries. So quite simply, a lot of the world was still fighting with weapons and types of warfare that had been used for centuries. And, you know, an example of that is if you go to China, for example, and it was very stark, in fact, with the invasions of China in the 19th century, the so-called Opium Wars and all of this, and the Taiping Rebellion and this kind of stuff. A lot of people were still using bows, and cavalry was still wearing armour, and it was the same in India. Now, it's funny that these often get termed as Indo-Persian, because actually Persia became industrialized, should we say, in warfare terms quite early on. So by the 1860s, for example, Persia, what's now Iran, had essentially a modern, you know, musket-equipped and uniformed army, standing army. They did have still some forms of troops, I think heavy cavalry and stuff, who still wore more traditional kind of armour and uniforms and stuff. But for the most part, Persia was pretty much industrialised by that point, as, for example, Japan had become as well. Whereas if you go to Japan in 1800, it was still kind of like almost samurai era. You go to Japan in 1860 and boom, they're wearing French-style uniforms and using muskets and importing guns from America and all kinds. But in India, what you have is lots of princely states. So first thing to say is India wasn't a country, really. It was a series of little princedoms, and some of which had alliances with each other, some of which hated each other, some of which were under British control, some of which were under independent control or kind of semi-British protectionism. And obviously the East India Company kind of ate up these princedoms, and that's how you ended up with the so-called British Raj ruling over India, sort of piecemeal, piece by piece. But nevertheless, there were little states within India, and there were lots of conflicts going on, also on the northwest frontier with the Afghan border and with Nepal as well. So they're on the borderlands between the different kind of cultures, if you want to term it that way. There were always areas of conflict, and there was always banditry, and there were local uprisings and this kind of stuff. And quite simply, a lot of people who were fighting, serving as either regular troops or indeed irregulars in India, say in the time of Wellington, when he was fighting in India in the Napoleonic era, there were a lot of troops there who were still using very traditional, old-fashioned types of weapons. Amongst those, these. Now, why were they still using these? Well, quite simply because lots of people were still wearing armour. And this is a specialised type of axe which is designed quite clearly for penetrating mail, specifically mail armour, or chainmail if you like. Okay, so these were used as as they were in medieval and Renaissance Europe. These were used as backup weapons, usually the primary weapon being a gun or a bow or a lance, something like this. But swords and axes were used as backup weapons, and very often the type of people that carry something like this would be mounted on horse, and very often they would have a shield as well, and very often they would have a sword and an axe, or a sword and a warhammer, or a sword and a mace. You also see a parallel to this in the 17th century in Europe, and it's very particular and noticeable that if you look at, for example, Polish cavalry, winged hussars, or if you look at Hungarian hussars, if you look at them in the 17th century, even to some degree into the 18th century, they often have a range of weapon types. And this kind of might seem like overkill by kind of later standards, by 19th century standards. But why would you carry a gun, a bow, a lance, an axe, or a warhammer, and a sword and a knife? Well, quite simply because they're different weapons for different jobs. It's a toolbox essentially. And you know, a lot of people ask me to make videos about this, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, concierge, I think, which is a type of estoc, a Polish estoc. And it's quite noticeable that Polish winged hussars, for example, use the concierge, and they have a sabre as well, szabla. And those are for two different things. Quite simply, the estoc is for penetrating armour at speed, or fighting armoured opponents in general, and the szabla or sabre is for fighting lightly armoured opponents, or indeed for fighting on foot. So, because of course, just because you're a cavalryman doesn't mean you're always on your horse. Sometimes you dismount, sometimes you have to go into buildings to root out the enemy, this kind of stuff. You might be involved in a siege. Very often cavalry have to fight on foot. And that's the same kind of context to what this axe fits into. In India, in the 18th and 19th centuries, quite often when Indian cavalrymen were fighting other Indian cavalrymen, very often or indeed Afghan cavalrymen, very often their opponents, particularly if they were wealthy, would be wearing armour, and that would be a mixture of mostly mail with some plate. So they'd usually have a kulakud type helmet, sometimes they'd have something like a turban or something else on their head, but usually a helmet, mail on the body, and sometimes incorporated within that mail would be pieces of plate. And quite simply, if you're fighting an armoured opponent, something like a talwar, which we grab here, a talwar is not very good at all against an opponent who's wearing armour. Whereas this is far more applicable because first of all you've got an edged blade here that you can use against lightly armoured opponents, or chopping a horse, or this kind of taking down a horse by hitting them in the neck, and you can flip the thing around and bash that. So essentially this is a multi-task weapon, which is probably obvious to most of you. But there's one more thing I just want to say, and I might talk more about this in the future before I leave this topic, and that is that this shaft, you think, well, that's a fairly narrow iron shaft, and if someone saw a photograph of this on the internet and went out to their blacksmith's forge and made a replica of this, like on Forged in Fire, it would end up a lot heavier than this original. One, because most people would probably assume that that blade is thicker than it is. It is, in fact, the blade is only about, say, 3 millimeters thick, I would say, at most. So first of all, that's fairly thin because it just doesn't need to be thick. You've only got that much depth to it and that much length, so it can be thin. But secondly, and this is the bit that I wanted to mention, the shaft is hollow. Now, I've spoken about hollow shafts before, but quite often you want to insert something into your hollow shaft to give it some strength. And now I have no way of telling, but from tapping this, it's very clear this has something inside it. It's not completely hollow. So what we've got here is essentially a tube which is formed out of a sheet, and if you look down this edge here, there's actually a seam running down there. So a flat sheet has been forged around like that. But inside is something that is, I would say, almost certainly wood or perhaps bamboo. To give it that kind of a resistance against compression and to give it a bit more rigidity and perhaps a little bit more mass as well. And this is something we absolutely find on European maces and axes and other types of weapon as well, is the fact that they might seem to have a hollow shaft, but my friend Fabrice Cognot, who's looked at lots of originals, confirms that many of them have wood inside. But nevertheless, they are still therefore hugely lighter than if you made a solid shaft of steel of that size. So there we go. Battle axes, warhammers, maces, still a thing in India in the 18th and 19th centuries, and probably even into the 20th centuries in some scenarios. Second point to note is that these shafts are often hollow, but that doesn't always mean empty. Sometimes they're hollow and filled with something organic, so they're lighter than a solid shaft, but they've still got quite a lot of strength to them. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.